Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I just turned 32 when I moved into that apartment on Cedar Avenue last September. It was a decent place in a 4-story building from the 60s. Nothing fancy, but the rent was reasonable, and it had these original hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places. I was working as a graphic designer for a startup downtown, pulling long hours but finally making enough to live alone after years of roommates. The divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, and I needed a fresh start somewhere nobody knew my story. I remember thinking how perfect the timing was when I found the listing online. Available immediately, 2nd floor, corner unit with lots of natural light. The landlord, Mr. Garrett, was this heavy-set guy with a permanent sunburn who kept talking about how quiet the building was, how everyone kept to themselves. The first few weeks were exactly what I needed. I'd wake up early, make coffee in my tiny kitchen with the yellow walls, and sit by the window watching people head to work. My cat, Whiskers, loved the wide windowsills and spent most of his time sprawled out in the sunshine. I met a few neighbors in passing, mostly just polite nods in the hallway. There was an elderly couple on the 3rd floor who always smelled like menthol cigarettes, a young guy on the 1st floor who played his music too loud on weekends, and next door to me lived this man named Gordon. He was probably mid-40s, always wore the same faded blue maintenance uniform even on weekends, had this thick beard that never seemed properly groomed. The first time we met, he was standing in the hallway when I was moving boxes in, just watching. He introduced himself, shook my hand for way too long, and kept asking if I needed help even after I'd said no 3 times. Around mid-October, little things started happening. First, it was my favorite coffee mug, the one with the cartoon avocado that my sister gave me. I always left it on the counter after washing it, but one morning it was in the cabinet with the plates. Then my phone charger disappeared from where I always plugged it in by the couch, only to show up days later in the bathroom drawer. I blamed myself, figured I was just stressed from the new project at work, moving things around without thinking. But then Whiskers started acting strange. He'd sit in the kitchen for hours, staring at the cabinets under the sink, sometimes pawing at them or making these low growling sounds I'd never heard from him before. I actually took him to the vet, thinking maybe he was sick, but they said he was perfectly healthy. The door situation started the last week of October. I've always been paranoid about locking up, a habit from living in sketchy neighborhoods during college. I'd check the deadbolt twice before bed, sometimes even getting up to check a 3rd time, but I started waking up to find the chain undone. Just the chain, never the deadbolt. The first time, I convinced myself I'd forgotten. The second time, I thought maybe the chain was loose and sliding open somehow. I even asked Mr. Garrett to look at it, and he tightened the screws, said it was solid, but it kept happening. I'd also noticed subtle things, like my shoes being slightly out of line by the door, or the living room blinds adjusted to a different angle. I started taking photos before bed, comparing them in the morning, and sure enough, things were moving. I ran into Gordon more frequently after that, always in the hallway when I was coming home from work. He'd be there checking his mail at 6:30, even though mail came at noon. Or he'd be fixing something in the hallway, a light bulb that worked fine, a doormat that wasn't even his. He started commenting on specific things about my routine, like how I must really love that Thai place on Fordham Road, since I ordered from there every Friday, or asking if my sister enjoyed her visit the previous weekend. Things he could only know if he'd been watching my comings and goings, seeing my takeout bags, listening through the walls. When I mentioned I was thinking about getting a security camera, his whole demeanor shifted. His face got red, and he went on this weird rant about privacy, how cameras made people paranoid, how the building was safe, and we all needed to trust each other. The breaking point came on a Monday night in early November. I'd been at a work presentation until almost 10, completely exhausted, just wanting to shower and crash. When I walked into my apartment, something was immediately wrong. The air felt different, like someone else's presence was still lingering. My laptop was open on the coffee table, which was impossible because I specifically remembered closing it that morning. There were crumbs on my kitchen counter, and I hadn't eaten there in days. But the worst part was the smell, this mixture of stale cigarettes and some kind of musky cologne that definitely wasn't mine. It was strongest in my bedroom. My jewelry box had been moved just an inch to the left, and my underwear drawer wasn't fully closed. I stood there in my own bedroom feeling violated in a way I couldn't even fully articulate. That's when I heard it, a soft thump from somewhere inside my apartment, like someone accidentally bumping into furniture. I grabbed my phone and a knife from the kitchen, then methodically checked every room, every closet, behind every door. Nothing. Nobody. But I knew someone had been there. Maybe still was there somehow. I called 911, my voice shaking as I explained everything to the dispatcher. 2 officers showed up within 15 minutes. A younger woman named Officer Daniels and her partner, an older guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They walked through the apartment, checking windows, testing the locks. The older cop kept giving me these looks like I was wasting their time, asking if I'd been drinking, if I was on any medication. But Officer Daniels took me seriously. She noticed that Whiskers was hiding under the bed, which she said was unusual for a cat when their owner was home. She stood in my kitchen for a long time, running her hands along the cabinets, checking the walls. That's when she found it. Behind the cabinet under my sink, the back panel was loose. Not just loose, it had been carefully modified with hinges so small you'd never notice unless you were really searching. When she pulled it open, we could see straight through into Gordon's apartment. He'd cut through the drywall between our units, creating a passage just large enough for someone to crawl through. The edges were smooth, sanded down, like he'd taken his time making sure it wouldn't snag on clothing. Officer Daniels called for backup immediately. Within minutes, my apartment was full of police, forensics people taking photos, detectives asking me questions. They found Gordon trying to leave through the building's back exit with a duffel bag. Inside it were some of my missing items, including that avocado mug, plus things I hadn't even realized were gone like a hairbrush, several photographs from my photo albums, and a spare key to my apartment that I kept hidden in a kitchen drawer. The detective who interviewed me, Detective Bryant, told me Gordon had been doing this for at least 2 months, probably since the week I moved in. He'd known the previous tenant, helped him move out, and that's when he'd started working on the passage. The maintenance uniform wasn't real. Gordon didn't work for the building or any company. He'd been unemployed for over a year, living off disability checks, spending his days in his apartment and, apparently, mine. They found notebooks in his place with detailed logs of my schedule, what I wore each day, phone conversations he'd overheard, even notes about my menstrual cycle based on products in my bathroom trash. He had a whole drawer full of plastic bags with items he'd taken, each one labeled with the date. There were things from other women too, former tenants from over the years, though I was the only one he'd built a passage for. What really got me was the photos they found on his computer. Hundreds of them, all taken inside my apartment while I was at work or asleep. Pictures of me sleeping, my mouth slightly open, hair spread across the pillow. Pictures of my clothes laid out on the bed like I was still wearing them. There was even video from a small camera he'd hidden in my shower drain, which explained why the water had been draining slowly. The forensics team said he'd been incredibly careful about when he entered, usually during my regular work hours, but sometimes he'd gotten bolder. Those nights when I'd woken up feeling watched, that instinct had been right. He'd been there, probably standing in my bedroom doorway, just watching me sleep. They found his fingerprints on my bed frame, my bathroom mirror, inside my closet. He'd touched everything, been everywhere, made himself at home in my private space. Gordon pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including burglary, stalking, and invasion of privacy. He got 8 years in prison, eligible for parole in 5. The prosecutor said it could have been worse if he'd touched me physically, but somehow that distinction didn't make me feel any better. Mr. Garrett had to pay for the wall repairs and gave me 3 months free rent, probably just to avoid a lawsuit. I stayed there exactly 1 more week while I looked for a new place, sleeping on a friend's couch because I couldn't stand being in that apartment at night. Every sound from the walls made me panic. Every creak of the floorboards sent me into a spiral. I'd catch myself checking behind the kitchen cabinets in the middle of the night, running my hands along the walls, searching for seams that shouldn't be there. Even Whiskers was different, jumpy and aggressive, hissing at shadows. I live in a different state now, a 5th-floor apartment with no shared walls except the floor and ceiling. I installed my own security system the day I moved in, cameras in every room that upload to the cloud, motion sensors, the works. My friends think I'm paranoid, but they didn't see those photos, didn't read those notebooks where someone had documented every detail of their life like they were a science experiment. Sometimes I still wake up at night and lie perfectly still, listening for sounds that don't belong, wondering if someone's watching. The detective told me Gordon had been a model prisoner so far, keeping to himself, no incidents. She also told me they'd found similar modifications in 2 other buildings where he'd lived before, though those passages had been sealed up years ago. Nobody knows how many women he'd watched, how many private moments he'd stolen. I changed my name legally last year, deleted all my social media, got a remote job so I could move whenever I felt unsafe. Maybe that makes him win in some way, changing my whole life because of what he did. But at least now when I check my locks at night, when I inspect my walls for signs of tampering, I know I'm not crazy. Sometimes being paranoid means you're paying attention. At 26, I finally had enough saved up for a down payment on a small house in Riverside Heights, about 40 minutes outside of Chicago. It was early October 2022, and after years of cramped apartments with paper-thin walls and neighbors who treated midnight like party hour, I was ready for some peace and quiet. The place wasn't much to look at. A single-story ranch from the 70s with faded yellow siding and a kitchen that screamed for renovation. But it had a decent backyard, a detached garage, and most importantly, it was mine. I'd been working as a network technician for a medical billing company for 4 years, pulling overtime whenever I could, eating ramen more nights than I'd like to admit, all for this moment. The neighborhood seemed perfect too, mostly older folks who'd lived there since the houses were built, the kind of people who kept their lawns pristine and waved when you drove past. The first few days were everything I'd imagined. I spent my evenings unpacking boxes, setting up my gaming setup in the spare bedroom, and actually enjoying the silence. No more bass thumping through the ceiling, no more couples fighting in the hallway at 3 a.m. Just the occasional car passing by and the rustling of the huge oak tree in my backyard. But on my 4th morning there, a Wednesday if I remember right, I stepped out onto the back porch with my coffee and noticed something weird. There were muddy footprints across the wooden deck, big ones, maybe size 11 or 12 boots. They started at the edge of the porch near the yard, went right up to my sliding glass door, and then traced back the same way. Thing is, we hadn't had rain in over 2 weeks. The yard was bone dry, the grass actually starting to yellow in spots. I walked around the entire property but couldn't find any mud anywhere. No leaky hose, no wet spots, nothing that would explain where someone could have gotten their boots that filthy. I grabbed some paper towels and cleaned them up, figuring maybe someone got confused and came to the wrong house. The neighborhood had a lot of similar-looking ranches, and I'd already gotten mail for the previous owner twice. But the next morning, there they were again. Same muddy prints, same path. From the yard to my sliding door and back. This time I took photos with my phone. The mud was this weird reddish-brown color, almost like clay, with deep tread marks that had these distinctive diagonal lines through them. I posted about it on the neighborhood Facebook group, trying to keep it light, just asking if anyone else had seen someone wandering around at night. Most responses were about checking my cameras, which I didn't have yet, or suggestions about getting a motion light. But one comment caught my attention. Mrs. Donovan from 2 streets over mentioned that the previous owner, a guy named Carl, had moved out pretty suddenly after living there for less than a year. She didn't say why, Just that one day his moving truck showed up and he was gone by evening. That afternoon, I installed a motion sensor light I picked up from Home Depot, one of those LED floodlights that could probably blind a pilot flying overhead. I also spread some flour across the porch before bed, an old trick my grandmother taught me for catching mice in the pantry. Figured it might show more detail than the wooden boards. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. Around 2 a.m., the motion light kicked on. I practically fell out of bed rushing to the window, but by the time I pulled the curtain aside, the backyard was empty. Just that harsh white light illuminating the grass and the oak trees' twisted shadows. I stood there for probably 10 minutes watching, waiting, but nothing moved. When I finally went back to bed, I left the curtain cracked just enough to see if the light triggered again. The next morning, the flower told a different story. The footprints were there, but this time I could see exactly what happened. The boot prints came from the yard like before, but in the flower I could see where they'd stood, right at my sliding door. For a long time, based on how the flour was compressed and scattered. There were these weird marks too, like someone had been kneeling or crouching, and thin lines where fingers had traced along the glass. The worst part was a clear spot in the flour, roughly face-shaped, where someone had pressed close enough to the door that their breath had blown the flour away. They'd been looking inside, into my living room, where I'd fallen asleep on the couch the night before while watching Netflix. I called the police that morning, but they didn't seem too concerned. The officer who came by, a younger guy who looked fresh out of the academy, took some notes, suggested I get security cameras, and mentioned that break-ins were pretty rare in the neighborhood. He theorized it might be kids playing pranks, or maybe someone confused, possibly intoxicated. I took the day off work and drove to Best Buy, dropped almost $800 on a security system with 4 cameras. Spent the whole afternoon setting them up, one covering the front door, one on each side of the house, and one with a perfect view of the back porch and sliding door. The app sent alerts straight to my phone, and I could watch the feeds live from anywhere. That night, I made sure all the doors were locked, even pushed my kitchen table against the sliding door as an extra barrier. I lay in bed with my phone propped up on the nightstand, the camera feeds displayed in a grid. The backyard was clearly visible in the infrared mode, everything washed in that eerie black and white. Around 11 p.m. I was starting to drift off when I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like metal on glass. My eyes shot to the phone screen, and there he was. A man standing at my sliding door, working something thin between the door and the frame. He was wearing dark coveralls, like a mechanic or janitor might wear, and work boots, the source of those muddy prints, no doubt. But his face was what made my chest tighten. He looked completely normal, maybe mid-40s, clean-shaven with thinning hair. Not some wild-eyed crazy person like you'd expect. He was focused, methodical, occasionally glancing up at the camera like he knew it was there but didn't care. And then he started talking. I couldn't hear him clearly through the glass and the distance from my bedroom, but I could see his mouth moving. I turned up the volume on the camera app, and that's when I heard it. My name. He was repeating my name, soft and steady, like he was calling a scared animal. "Nathan," he kept saying. "Nathan, just open up. We need to talk, Nathan." The thing is, I hadn't put my name on the mailbox yet. No packages had been delivered. I'd only told a couple neighbors my first name in passing, but somehow this guy knew it, standing there at midnight, trying to jimmy my door while whispering my name like we were old friends. I called 911 immediately, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. The dispatcher said units were on the way, told me to stay where I was and not confront the intruder. Through the camera, I watched him suddenly stop and tilt his head, like he was listening to something. Then he pulled out a flip phone, weird detail that stuck with me, checked it, and calmly walked away from the door. Not rushed, not panicked, just a casual stroll across my yard and into the darkness beyond the camera's range. By the time the police arrived 6 minutes later, he was long gone. They searched the area, took the camera footage, and this time they seemed to take it more seriously. The officer in charge, a sergeant named Reeves, asked me if I had any enemies, any stalkers, anyone who might want to harm me. I couldn't think of anyone. I'd lived a pretty boring life. Work, home, gaming with friends online, occasional dates that never went anywhere. Nothing that would make someone target me like this. Sergeant Reeves suggested I stay somewhere else for the night, but I was stubborn. This was my house, the place I'd worked years to afford, and I wasn't going to let some creep drive me out after less than a week. Instead, I moved my laptop setup to the living room where I could watch the sliding door directly, grabbed my old baseball bat from the garage, and settled in for a long night. The police said they'd have a patrol car swing by every hour or so. Around 3 a.m., fighting to stay awake with my 5th cup of coffee, I noticed something on the camera feed. The man was back, but this time he wasn't alone. There was someone else with him, smaller, wearing what looked like a hooded raincoat even though it was a clear night. They stood at the edge of my property, just barely in view of the side camera. The man in coveralls was pointing at different windows, at the garage, making gestures like he was explaining something. The smaller figure nodded along, and then they did something that made my whole body go rigid. They both turned and looked directly at the camera, directly at me through the screen, and waved. A slow, deliberate wave, like they were saying hello to an old friend. I was already dialing 911 when they started walking toward the house. Not toward the back door this time, but around to the front. On my phone screen, I watched them disappear from one camera and appear on the next. The woman, I could see now it was a woman under the hood, was carrying something in her hand. Through the front door camera, I saw her kneel down and place it on my welcome mat while the man stood watch. Then they both walked away, unhurried, down the sidewalk like a couple out for an evening stroll. The police arrived faster this time, maybe 4 minutes, and when they checked the front door, they found what she'd left. It was a manila envelope with Nathan written on it in neat handwriting. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Pictures of me at my old apartment, at work, at the grocery store, at the gym. Some were recent, from just days before I moved. Others were older, going back months. In every single one, no matter where I was or what I was doing, there in the background were those same 2 people. Sometimes barely visible, sometimes obvious once you knew to look for them. They'd been watching me long before I ever bought this house. The police took it seriously now. Sergeant Reeves called in detectives, and they had me go through every photo, trying to identify locations and dates. One detective, a woman named Foster, noticed something I hadn't. In 3 of the photos, there was a partial license plate visible on a van in the background. Always the same van, a white Ford Transit with rust spots along the wheel wells. They ran the plates and got a hit. The van was registered to a Carl Brennan, the same Carl who'd lived in my house before me. The previous owner. Detective Foster pulled his driver's license photo, and I immediately recognized him as the man in coveralls. Turns out Carl had never actually sold the house. He'd been evicted after failing to pay the mortgage for 8 months, and the bank had foreclosed. The house sat empty for 2 months before being sold to me through a standard auction. Carl had apparently been convinced the bank had stolen his home illegally, and according to some posts they found on his social media, he believed whoever bought it was part of the conspiracy. The woman was his sister, Joyce, who'd lost her job as a nurse after failing a psych evaluation 2 years prior. They picked them both up that same morning at a motel about 10 miles away. In their room, police found notebooks full of information about me. My daily routines, my license plate, my work schedule, even what kind of coffee I ordered at Starbucks. They had printed out my LinkedIn, my old dating profiles, even forum posts I'd made years ago about gaming builds. But the most disturbing thing was a floor plan of my house, Carl's house as he saw it, with notes about which windows were easiest to force, which rooms had the best hiding spots, and a detailed schedule of when I was most likely to be asleep. They'd been planning something, though neither would say what during questioning. Both of them were charged with stalking and attempted breaking and entering. Carl got 18 months in county jail. Joyce got 12 with mandatory psychiatric treatment. I thought about moving immediately, but the detective convinced me to stay, said they'd keep an eye on the place. I installed more locks, a security bar for the sliding door, and even got a dog, a German Shepherd mix named Duke who barks at everything. It's been over a year now, and I still check those cameras obsessively every night before bed. Sometimes I wonder if I'm really alone, or if someone else is out there, watching, waiting for their turn to claim what they think is theirs. I never thought buying that house in Oakwood would turn my life into a nightmare. But sometimes the worst things hide in the most ordinary places. It was late spring of 2016, about 2 years after my wife passed away from cancer, and I finally felt ready to leave our old home behind. Too many memories in every corner, you know what I mean? I found this place on Willow Drive through a realtor friend who gave me a great deal. A single-story ranch with a pool and a huge backyard, perfect for starting fresh. The previous owner, an elderly man named Harold Finch, had apparently moved to Florida in a hurry to be closer to his daughter. The house had been sitting empty for about 8 months before I moved in, and honestly, it showed. The grass was knee-high, leaves clogged the pool, and there was this old wooden shed at the far corner of the yard that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The first few weeks were pretty normal, just me fixing things up, cleaning out the pool, trying to make the place feel like home. I remember it was a Saturday morning in June when I first noticed something weird about the area near the shed. I was out there with my mower trying to tackle that overgrown mess of a lawn, when I hit this spot about 15 feet from the shed, where the ground just gave way a little. Not like a sinkhole or anything dramatic, but the mower wheels sank down maybe 3 or 4 inches, and when I pulled it back, there was this depression in the earth. The grass there was different too, darker, thicker, growing in this strange circular pattern maybe 6 feet across. I figured maybe there used to be a septic tank there or something, made a mental note to check it out later, and kept mowing. But then I caught this smell, faint at first, like rotting vegetables mixed with something chemical. It got stronger the closer I got to that soft spot, so I decided to leave that section for another day. That smell didn't go away. Over the next few days, especially when the sun hit that part of the yard in the afternoon, it would drift across to the patio where I like to sit with my coffee. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was persistent, like when you leave meat in the trash too long during summer. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was probably just decomposing roots from an old tree or maybe a dead animal under the ground. But here's the thing that really bothered me. My neighbor, Mrs. Hoffman, this sweet lady in her 70s who'd lived there for 30 years, she came by one afternoon with a casserole and mentioned something odd. She said Harold had been such a meticulous gardener, always out there tending to every inch of that yard, except for that one corner by the shed. In all the years she'd known him, she'd never once seen him plant anything there, or even walk on that patch of ground. She thought maybe he kept chemicals there that killed the soil or something. I couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Hoffman said. So the next morning, a Monday, I grabbed a shovel from the garage and decided to dig a small test hole, just to see what was down there. The ground was surprisingly easy to break through. Not hard-packed like the rest of the yard, but loose, almost fluffy, like it had been turned over before and never properly compressed. About a foot down, the soil changed color, went from brown to this grayish black, and the smell hit me like a punch to the gut. It was sweet and rotten and metallic all at once, nothing like any dead animal I'd ever encountered. I kept digging, telling myself I'd stop at 2 feet, but then my shovel hit something that made a dull, hollow sound. Not like hitting a rock or a pipe, softer, but solid. I scraped away more dirt and saw what looked like dirty, yellowed plastic sheeting, the heavy-duty kind contractors use, wrapped around something underneath. My first instinct was to pull the whole thing out, but something made me stop. The shape under the plastic was wrong, too long, too irregular to be a bag of chemicals or dead pet. I got down on my knees and used my hands to clear more dirt away, and that's when I saw it through a tear in the plastic. What looked like fabric, maybe denim, stained dark and clinging to something beneath. My mouth went completely dry, and I sat back on my heels, just staring at that hole for probably 5 minutes, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. But the more I looked, the more certain I became. The shape was about 6 feet long, maybe a bit less, curved in the middle like someone curled up on their side. I pulled out my phone with dirt-caked fingers and almost called 911 right then, but stopped myself. What if I was wrong? What if it was just old clothes wrapped around construction waste or something? I decided I needed to know for sure before calling anyone, so I carefully peeled back a corner of the plastic where it was already torn. The smell that came out was indescribable. Not just decay, but something chemical too, like formaldehyde mixed with soil. Underneath was definitely clothing, a flannel shirt, red and black checkered, the pattern still visible despite the staining. And below that, partially visible through another tear in the fabric, was something pale and waxy looking that made every hair on my body stand up. It was skin, or what was left of it, preserved in some weird way by whatever chemicals had been used. I scrambled backwards so fast I fell on my ass, phone tumbling into the grass. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, my voice probably shaking as I told them I'd found what I thought was a body in my backyard. The dispatcher kept me on the line, asking me questions I could barely focus on answering, while I stared at that hole, at that thing I'd uncovered, wondering who the hell was buried in my yard. The police showed up within 15 minutes. 2 patrol cars at first, then a detective in an unmarked sedan, then the crime scene van. They taped off my entire backyard like something out of a TV show, yellow tape stretching from my fence to the house. The detective, a woman named Detective Walsh with gray streaks in her hair and these intense green eyes, asked me to walk her through everything from the beginning while the forensics team set up a tent over the hole. I told her about Harold Finch, about the soft ground, the smell, Mrs. Hoffman's comments about him avoiding that area. She wrote everything down in this little notebook, occasionally asking me to clarify details. When I mentioned Harold had moved to Florida, she exchanged a look with one of the uniformed officers that made my chest tighten. "We'll need to verify that," she said carefully. And that's when it hit me. Nobody had actually seen Harold leave. The realtor had handled everything through power of attorney with his supposed daughter. By late afternoon, they'd excavated a much larger area, and what they found turned my quiet retirement plans into a living nightmare. It wasn't just one body. There were 3, all wrapped in the same plastic sheeting, all in different stages of decay. The forensics guy, who looked way too young to be doing that job, explained to Detective Walsh within my earshot that based on the preservation and insect activity, they'd been there for different lengths of time. The oldest one, maybe 5 or 6 years. The newest, probably less than 2. That meant Harold had been living above them, walking over them every day while he played the role of the friendly neighborhood retiree. The detective showed me photos on her tablet, missing persons reports from the area going back years. One was a traveling salesman named Robert Price, who disappeared in 2014. Another was a homeless veteran called Tommy, who used to hang around the local shopping center. The third one they couldn't identify yet, but the clothing suggested it was a woman. The investigation moved fast after that. Detective Walsh had officers canvassing the neighborhood, and what they learned painted a disturbing picture of Harold Finch. Several neighbors remembered him having visitors who never seemed to leave through the front door. He'd tell people they were relatives passing through, or old friends from his military days, but nobody ever saw them actually depart. Mrs. Hoffman remembered one specific incident from about 18 months ago. A young woman with a green backpack had knocked on Harold's door asking about yard work, and Harold had invited her in to discuss it over coffee. Mrs. Hoffman never saw her leave, but Harold was out there the next morning, working near the shed with his wheelbarrow and bags of lime. At the time, she thought he was just doing garden maintenance. The detective also discovered that Harold's supposed daughter in Florida didn't exist. The power of attorney documents were forged. The Florida address was fake, and the money from the house sale had been transferred to an offshore account that vanished into a maze of shell companies. They brought in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar after that, searching every inch of the property. The dogs went crazy near the basement wall on the north side of the house, and when they broke through the concrete, they found another plastic-wrapped bundle, this one much older, probably from the early 2000s based on the clothing. The basement discovery changed everything because property records showed Harold had only bought the house in 2008. That meant the previous owner, or someone before Harold, had started this horrific pattern. Detective Walsh spent hours going through old records and found that the house had changed hands 4 times since 1995, always sold quickly, always for cash, always to single men who lived alone. Each owner had left suddenly for family emergencies or job opportunities elsewhere. The FBI got involved at that point, suspecting we'd stumbled onto something much bigger than just Harold Finch. They thought maybe this house had been used by some kind of network, passed between people who shared certain dark interests, though they wouldn't tell me more than that. The investigation went on for 3 weeks. They found a total of 7 bodies on the property, 4 in the yard, 1 in the basement, and 2 more under the concrete slab of the garage. The forensics team practically took the house apart looking for evidence, pulling up floorboards, checking inside walls, going through the attic insulation. They found journals hidden in the shed, wrapped in waterproof bags, containing detailed records that went back 20 years. Different handwriting styles, different authors, but all documenting the same sick activities. The FBI agent in charge, a tall guy named Special Agent Rivers with this exhausted look like he'd seen too much, finally explained that they believed the house had been a designated disposal site for a group that operated across state lines. Harold had been the last caretaker, and when things got too hot, maybe he got spooked by something or someone was getting suspicious, he'd arranged his own disappearance. They traced him eventually, not to Florida but to Quebec, living under a false identity. The Canadian authorities arrested him 3 weeks after the first body was discovered, found him in a modest apartment with hair dyed black and 20 pounds lighter, but they identified him through fingerprints. The trial was all over the news, but I couldn't bring myself to follow it closely. I moved out the day the FBI cleared the scene, stayed in a motel for 2 months while I sorted out the legal mess of breaking the lease. The property management company refunded everything and then some. They were terrified of lawsuits. I found a small apartment downtown, somewhere with no yard, no basement, just the 3rd floor of a building where I could hear my neighbors living their normal lives through the walls. Harold Finch got 4 life sentences, no possibility of parole, and gave up names of others in exchange for being kept in protective custody. 12 more arrests followed across 6 states. But here's what keeps me awake at night. In his confession, Harold said the house on Willow Drive wasn't the only one. There were others, scattered across the country, innocent-looking homes with well-maintained lawns and friendly neighbors who'd wave when you walked by. He wouldn't say how many or where they were, just smiled this empty smile and said they'd been doing this for decades. I think about all the people house hunting right now, excited about finding their dream home, not knowing what might be buried beneath their feet. I check missing persons reports obsessively now, looking for patterns, wondering if another house somewhere is about to reveal its secrets. The FBI says they're investigating, following leads, but how do you find something like that when it's been hidden so well for so long? All I know is I'll never own another house with a yard again. The rental listing seemed perfect for us. A 2-bedroom house with a fenced backyard in a quiet neighborhood just outside Denver, Colorado. I'd been searching for months after the divorce finalized in early 2023, desperate to give my 7-year-old daughter Chloe some stability after everything we'd been through. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Jameson with thick glasses and a hearing aid that whistled when he talked, assured me the area was family-friendly. He kept mentioning how the previous tenants, a retired couple, had lived there peacefully for 12 years. The rent was slightly below market value, which should have been my first warning sign. But as a dental hygienist supporting a child on one income, I couldn't pass up the opportunity. We moved in on a Saturday in late August, the summer heat making everything feel heavy and slow. Chloe immediately fell in love with her new room. It had these built-in shelves perfect for her collection of ceramic horses, each one named after a different constellation. That first night, after I'd tucked her in and read her favorite book about a brave rabbit who solves mysteries, I sat on our worn leather couch, feeling genuinely hopeful for the first time in months. The house smelled like fresh paint and pine sol from my cleaning frenzy, and through the kitchen window, I could see fireflies dancing in the backyard. I remember thinking how different everything felt from our cramped apartment downtown, how the silence here was almost unsettling after years of sirens and traffic. Around 11, I did my usual routine of checking all the locks twice, a habit from the apartment days, and noticed nothing unusual except for a cat sitting on the fence post, its eyes reflecting green in the porch light. Monday morning changed everything. I stepped out to grab the newspaper. Yes, this neighborhood still had actual paper delivery, and nearly tripped over what was scattered on our front steps. 7 cigarette butts, all the same brand with gold filters, arranged almost deliberately in a semicircle. Next to them sat 3 beer bottles, the labels peeled off in long strips and stuffed inside like someone had nervous hands and too much time. The bottles were still damp with morning dew, but when I picked one up, I could smell stale beer mixed with something else. Cologne, maybe, that musky kind older men wear. My first thought was teenagers, maybe kids from the neighborhood testing boundaries with the new residents. I grabbed a grocery bag and cleaned it all up before Chloe could see, telling myself it was probably a one-time thing, maybe even meant for a different house. But it happened again Wednesday morning, except this time there were 9 cigarette butts and 4 bottles, plus a crumpled receipt from a gas station dated 2:47 a.m. The receipt had a coffee stain on it and listed items I'll never forget: zip ties, latex gloves, and a flashlight. My chest got tight reading it, but I kept rationalizing. Maybe someone dropped it by accident. Maybe it blew over from another yard. I called the non-emergency police line, and the officer who answered sounded barely awake, probably pulling the night shift. He took my report with the enthusiasm of someone filling out paperwork for a lost cat, said they'd have someone patrol the area more frequently. I didn't mention the receipt details because I felt stupid, paranoid, like one of those women who overreacts to everything after watching too many true crime documentaries. That afternoon, I installed a Ring doorbell camera with my own shaking fingers and a YouTube tutorial, dropping the screwdriver twice because I kept looking behind me at every little sound. Friday night was when everything escalated beyond my ability to rationalize. Chloe had been complaining about a toothache all day, so I gave her children's Tylenol and tucked her in early, around 7:30. Her room faced the backyard, and I always kept her curtains closed at night. Another leftover paranoia from apartment living. I was in the living room folding laundry and watching a cooking show, the kind where they make impossible desserts in impossible time frames, when I heard it. This breathing sound, heavy and deliberate, right outside Chloe's window. Not like someone who'd been running, more like someone trying to breathe quietly but failing, the way my ex-husband used to sound when he'd come home drunk and try to sneak past me sleeping on the couch. The breathing had a rhythm to it. 3 deep inhales, a pause, then a long exhale that fogged up the glass. I could see the condensation forming on the window from where I stood frozen in the hallway. I grabbed my phone and the baseball bat I kept behind my bedroom door, my bare feet silent on the carpet as I crept toward Chloe's room. She was still asleep, curled up with her stuffed elephant named Mr. Peanuts, completely unaware. The breathing continued, and now I could hear something else, fingernails dragging across the window screen in slow, deliberate lines. Through a gap in the curtains, I saw a shadow, distinctly human, wearing what looked like a baseball cap pulled low. The figure wasn't trying to break in, just standing there, breathing and touching the window like they were trying to memorize its dimensions. My finger hovered over 911, but then I heard footsteps moving away from the window, heavy boots on gravel, heading toward the side of the house where my bedroom was. The motion sensor light clicked on, flooding the side yard with harsh white light, and the footsteps quickened but didn't run. Whoever it was had been here before, knew exactly where they were going. Then came the sound that made every hair on my body stand up. The doorknob to the back door turning slowly, testing. A pause. Then the front doorknob. Another pause. The sliding glass door to the patio rattling gently in its track. He was methodical, patient, moving from entry point to entry point like he had a checklist. I finally called 911, whispering to the dispatcher while creeping to each door and window to make sure they were locked. The woman on the line kept asking me to speak up, but I was terrified he'd hear me. No, I was awake and aware. Through the peephole in the front door, I saw him clearly for the first time. A man maybe in his 40s, wearing dark work clothes and that baseball cap I'd glimpsed earlier. He had this perfectly ordinary face, the kind you'd see at a hardware store or pumping gas, except for his eyes. Even from that distance through that tiny lens, I could see they were completely focused, studying my door locks like they were a puzzle he was determined to solve. The testing of the locks went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes according to my phone log. He'd try a door, wait, listen, then move to the next one. At the garage door, he spent extra time, and I heard metal scraping, maybe a screwdriver or a pick. I was standing in the hallway between Chloe's room and mine, bat in one hand, phone in the other, when I heard him at my bedroom window. This time he wasn't just breathing, he was talking, so quiet I could barely make out the words. "I know you're awake," he said, his voice calm and almost friendly, like we were neighbors chatting over a fence. "Your breathing changed when you heard me. You stopped folding that laundry. Blue towel in your hands, right? The one with the dolphins on it." My legs nearly gave out because he was right. I'd been holding Chloe's dolphin beach towel when I first heard him. He'd been watching through the windows before going to Chloe's room, probably for who knows how long, learning our routines, our habits, when we were most vulnerable. "The little one takes medicine at 7:30 on Fridays," he continued, and I heard him shift positions, maybe kneeling by the window. "You always check her forehead with the back of your hand, not your palm. Sweet kid, looks just like you, especially when she scrunches her nose at vegetables." Every word made me want to scream, but I stayed silent, the dispatcher still on the line saying units were 3 minutes out. He knew things only someone who'd been watching for days would know. "You double-checked the locks, but you forgot something tonight. The bathroom window, the small one above the shower. The latch is broken, has been since before you moved in. The old couple never fixed it because who could fit through such a small space?" He laughed softly, and I heard joints popping like he was stretching. "I'm not a big man. Haven't eaten much lately. Been too busy watching, waiting for the right moment. Tonight feels right, doesn't it?" I ran to the bathroom, my feet slipping on the tile, and sure enough, the small window above the shower was unlocked, the latch hanging uselessly to one side. As I reached up to push it closed, I saw fingers, thin, dirty fingers, already gripping the outside edge, starting to push it open. I slammed my palm against them hard, heard him curse and withdraw, and managed to wedge the bat handle across the frame as a makeshift lock. His face appeared in the window for just a second, and I finally saw him clearly. Gaunt cheeks covered in patchy stubble, eyes bloodshot and wild, lips chapped and bleeding from being chewed. He smiled at me, showing yellowed teeth with gaps where some were missing. "Smart girl," he whispered. "But I've been in here before, you know. Last Sunday when you took Chloe to the farmer's market. Laid in your bed, smelled your pillows. The lavender shampoo is nice, but you should really replace that smoke detector battery in the hallway. It chirped the whole time I was here." The sirens were getting closer, and he tilted his head, listening. "They're coming up Birch Street. Be here in maybe 90 seconds. Guess I'll see you tomorrow night. Or maybe next week. I'm patient. I've got nothing but time." He disappeared from the window just as the first police cruiser pulled into my driveway, its lights painting everything red and blue. I ran to the front door, yanking it open before the officers even reached the porch, words tumbling out of me so fast they had to ask me to slow down and breathe. 2 officers searched the property while another stayed with me, taking notes as I showed him the bathroom window, the scratches on Chloe's window screen, the spots where he'd tested each lock. They found footprints in the flower bed beneath my bedroom window, cigarette butts matching the ones from my porch scattered near the fence, and something that made my knees buckle, a notebook wedged behind the garbage cans. Inside were pages and pages of observations. What time I left for work, when I picked up Chloe from school, what we ate for dinner, even notes about my phone calls that he could apparently hear through the kitchen window. The last entry, dated that morning, simply said, "Tonight after the medicine." They put out a description, but he was gone, melted back into whatever shadow he'd crawled from. We stayed in a hotel that night, and the next 5 nights after that while I broke my lease and found a new place 40 miles away. The police never found him, though they discovered he'd been living in a foreclosed house 2 streets over, mattress on the floor, walls covered with photos taken through our windows, pictures of us eating breakfast, watching TV, Chloe playing with her ceramic horses. Mr. Jameson, the landlord, finally admitted the previous tenants hadn't stayed 12 years. They'd broken their lease after 6 months, complaining about someone watching them. He'd painted over their concerns, lowered the rent, and hoped the next tenant wouldn't notice. I still check locks obsessively, installed cameras at our new place that alert my phone for any movement, and Chloe knows why we had to move, though I spared her the worst details. Sometimes I dream about that voice through the window, calm and knowing, and wake up checking the bathroom window even though this house doesn't have one above the shower. The detective called last month to say they'd found similar notebooks in 3 other cities, same handwriting, same patient observations. They think he picks single mothers, watches for weeks, maybe months, learning everything before he makes his move. "We were lucky," she said. "The others weren't. I don't feel lucky. I feel like we're just waiting for him to find us again, and this time, he already knows our patterns." My wife Jennifer and I had been hunting for houses for months when we found that colonial in rural Pennsylvania, about 40 minutes outside Pittsburgh. 8 years we'd been saving, cramming ourselves into tiny apartments, eating ramen more nights than I care to admit, all to scrape together a decent down payment. It was a 1940s house that had been sitting on the market for almost a year. Mr. Hutchinson, the elderly owner, had passed away, and his kids were practically begging someone to take it off their hands. They accepted our lowball offer so fast it should have been a red flag. But Jennifer was 7 months pregnant, and we were running out of time. We needed a place with a real nursery, not the closet we'd been calling a second bedroom in our apartment. Sure, the inspection report was a novel. Ancient wiring, pipes that belonged in a museum, windows painted shut since the Nixon administration, but nothing we couldn't tackle with some elbow grease and determination. After we moved in, every day brought a new project and a new problem. Our first week, the upstairs bathroom started leaking through the kitchen ceiling. Week 2, we discovered the previous owner had been using newspaper as insulation in the attic. Week 3, a family of raccoons decided our chimney was their new vacation home. But between all the chaos, we were making it ours, stripping away decades of floral wallpaper, sanding down original hardwood floors that had been buried under carpet since the 70s. About 6 weeks in, I decided to tackle the basement, thinking I could convert it into a proper home office. I was down there measuring for drywall when something struck me as wrong. According to my tape measure, the basement was a full 12 feet shorter than the foundation outside. When I really examined that north wall, I could see it. Different materials, newer concrete blocks, like someone had walled off a section decades after the house was built. I called Jennifer down to look at it, and she agreed something was definitely off. We spent the next hour tapping along the wall, listening for hollow spots until we found it, a section near the corner that sounded completely empty behind it. I grabbed my drill and made a small hole, just big enough to snake my phone through with the flashlight on. What I saw made no sense at first. It was a narrow corridor, maybe 3 feet wide, running along the entire length of the wall. There were wooden shelves built into one side, stocked with what looked like canned goods and gallon jugs of water. But that wasn't the strangest part. At the far end, barely visible in my phone's light, I could make out what appeared to be a small door, painted the same gray as the concrete walls, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Jennifer wanted to call someone right away, the police, the previous owner's kids, anybody, but I convinced her to let me open up the wall first. We needed to know what we were dealing with. I spent the next 3 hours with a sledgehammer and a crowbar, carefully taking down a section of the false wall. The smell hit us immediately, not death or decay, but something stale and medicinal, like a hospital room that hadn't been aired out in years. Those shelves I'd seen were stocked with enough supplies to last months. Canned soup, beans, powdered milk, boxes of crackers, all with expiration dates from 2015. There were also bottles of prescription medications, the labels too faded to read clearly, and several oxygen tanks lined up against one wall. Everything was organized meticulously, labeled with dates and contents in shaky handwriting. We made our way to that small door at the end of the corridor, Jennifer gripping my arm so tight it hurt. The door was locked with a heavy-duty deadbolt, but the key was hanging on a nail right beside it, like whoever built this wanted it to be secure from the outside, not the inside. When I opened it, we found ourselves staring into a room about the size of a large walk-in closet. There was a narrow bed pushed against one wall, neatly made with a faded quilt. A portable toilet sat in one corner, one of those camping ones, alongside several boxes of sanitary supplies. The walls were covered in photographs, dozens and dozens of them, all showing the same woman at different ages. Some looked recent, others decades old. In every photo where she appeared as an adult, she had this vacant expression, her eyes unfocused, like she wasn't really seeing the camera. What really made my gut twist was the calendar hanging above the bed, frozen on June 2015. Someone had been crossing off days with a red pen, but the marks stopped abruptly on the 18th. Next to the bed was a milk crate full of coloring books, all completely filled in with careful, childlike scrawls despite clearly being the work of an adult hand. There were puzzle books too, word searches and crosswords, hundreds of them, all completed in that same shaky handwriting we'd seen on the supply labels. Jennifer found a notebook tucked under the pillow, and when she opened it, her face went pale. Page after page of the same sentence written over and over, "I am safe here. Uncle Howard keeps me safe here. I am safe here." The writing got progressively worse as the pages went on, until the last entries were barely legible, just wavering lines trying to form words. I was still processing what we'd found when Jennifer discovered a filing box tucked behind the toilet. Inside were medical records, social security documents, and a birth certificate for someone named Dorothy Hutchinson, born in 1971. There were diagnosis papers from the early 90s, severe developmental disabilities, intermittent explosive disorder, references to violent outbursts and self-harm. But what caught my attention were the insurance papers. Apparently, Dorothy had been receiving disability benefits, and someone had been cashing those checks every month. The most recent statement was from 2015, showing regular deposits of whole $847 into an account under Howard Hutchinson's name. Howard, that must have been the Mr. Hutchinson who'd owned our house. According to the county records we'd seen during closing, he'd lived here alone since his wife died in 2008. Jennifer was already on the phone with 911 while I kept digging through the papers. There were receipts for the supplies, all paid in cash, dating back to 2010. 5 years. Someone had been keeping Dorothy in this hidden room for at least 5 years. I found medical prescriptions filled at different pharmacies across the county, never the same place twice in a row. Antipsychotics, sedatives, medications for various conditions, all prescribed to Dorothy but picked up by Howard. There was even a crude schedule taped to the inside of the filing box: when to give medications, when to bring food, when to empty the portable toilet. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in plastic, was a leather journal. Howard's journal. His handwriting was neat and precise in the beginning, talking about how Dorothy had attacked a neighbor's child, how the state wanted to institutionalize her, how he couldn't let that happen to his sister. "She's family," he wrote. "Family takes care of family, even when it's hard." The journal entries got darker as they went on. Howard wrote about Dorothy's deteriorating mental state, how she'd started refusing to eat, how she'd claw at the walls until her fingers bled. He'd had to increase her medications, sometimes doubling the doses just to keep her calm. By 2014, he was writing about his own health problems: diabetes, heart issues, difficulty making it down the stairs every day. His last entry was dated June 15th, 2015. "Dorothy hasn't spoken in 3 weeks. She just stares at the wall and rocks. I don't think she knows who I am anymore. I don't know how much longer I can do this. Maybe I should have let them take her. Maybe I was wrong. But it's too late now. Who would understand? Who would forgive this?" 3 days later, according to the calendar in Dorothy's room, someone stopped marking off the days. The police arrived within minutes, followed by detectives, forensics teams, and eventually social services. They found more than we'd discovered. There was a ventilation system Howard had rigged up, hidden behind the ceiling tiles. A baby monitor mounted in the corner so he could watch Dorothy from upstairs. They even found a second entrance we'd missed, a hidden panel that led to the old coal cellar, probably how he'd gotten her in and out without neighbors noticing. The detective told us they'd tracked down Howard's kids, who lived out of state. They swore they had no idea Dorothy even existed. Their father had told them his sister died in a car accident in the 90s. They'd never questioned why he lived alone in such a big house, why he never wanted them to visit, why he always met them at restaurants or their homes instead. The retirement home where Howard spent his final years confirmed he'd never mentioned having a sister during his stay there. They searched for Dorothy for weeks. The FBI got involved, thinking maybe Howard had moved her somewhere before going into the retirement home. They checked every hospital, every morgue, every Jane Doe case from 2015 onward. Nothing. The investigation revealed that Howard had been admitted to the retirement home in early 2016 after a severe stroke left him partially paralyzed. His children had found him collapsed in the house and made the arrangements. They'd hired a company to clean out what they thought was just hoarding in the basement. But those workers had only cleared the main area, never noticing the false wall. Dorothy had simply vanished somewhere between June 2015 and Howard's stroke in 2016. The detective's theory was that she'd died in that room, and Howard, in his deteriorating mental state, had somehow disposed of the body. But they never found any evidence. No DNA, no signs of violence. Nothing to indicate what had happened during those final months. We couldn't stay in that house. Even after the investigation ended, even after contractors opened up all the walls to make sure there were no other hidden spaces, we couldn't sleep there. Jennifer started having panic attacks every time she went into the basement. I'd lie awake at night thinking about Dorothy in that room, crossing off days on her calendar, writing those same words over and over while her mind slipped away. We sold the house at a massive loss and moved back into an apartment. The new owners were some young couple who thought they were getting a deal, just like we had. I wanted to warn them, but what would I say? That technically nothing supernatural happened there? That it was just human cruelty, the kind that happens behind closed doors every day? Sometimes I drive past the house and wonder if they've felt it yet, that weight in the basement, that wrongness in the air. Or maybe they've already found something we missed. Maybe there are more secrets in that house waiting behind other walls. All I know is that every time I see a "For sale by owner" sign now, especially on an old house with a too good price, I think about Dorothy Hutchinson and drive a little faster. Last spring, my wife Ashley and I finally saved enough to buy our first house. It was April, and we'd been married for just over 2 years, both of us teaching at the local high school in a small town in Ohio. The house was a foreclosure, which explained the price. A 1940s two-story colonial that had been empty for almost 3 years. The realtor, Mrs. Blackwood, was this tiny woman with silver hair pulled back so tight it made her eyes look surprised all the time. She kept mentioning how motivated the bank was to sell, practically pushing the keys into our hands. We should have asked more questions, but we were too excited about the hardwood floors, the original crown molding, and that huge backyard where we imagined our future kids would play. The inspection came back mostly clean, just some old pipes that would need replacing eventually, and a furnace that had maybe 5 good years left in it. The first week after moving in was a blur of unpacking boxes and arguing about where the couch should go. It was a Saturday morning when we decided to tackle the basement. We needed space for Ashley's photography equipment, and the basement seemed perfect. It was surprisingly dry for such an old house, with those thick stone walls that stayed cool even as spring turned warmer. There were 3 separate rooms down there, plus the main area where the previous owners had started building what looked like a workshop. The first room had shelves lining the walls, perfect for storage. The second was smaller, with a single window near the ceiling that let in these thin streams of dusty light. But the third door, tucked into the far corner where the stone walls met, that one was different. 4 industrial-sized slide bolts were drilled into the door frame, all on the outside, the kind you'd see on a barn door but heavier, more serious. The wood around them was splintered and damaged, like they'd been installed in a hurry, without much care for appearance. Ashley ran her fingers along the bolts while I grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox we'd brought down. The metal was cold and rough with rust, but not ancient rust. Maybe 10, 15 years old at most. What really made my chest tighten was realizing that each bolt was positioned at a different height. One near the floor, one at waist level, another at shoulder height, and the last one almost at the top of the frame. Whoever installed these wanted to make absolutely sure that door stayed shut. I remember Ashley made this nervous laugh, the kind she does when she's trying to pretend something doesn't bother her, and said we should probably just leave it alone, maybe call the realtor first. But I was already working the crowbar under the first bolt. The screws came out easier than expected, like the wood had gone soft around them. Each bolt made this awful screech as I pried it loose, metal grinding against metal, until finally all 4 were off and piled on the concrete floor, like broken fingers. The door itself was heavier than it looked, solid oak that had warped slightly over the years. It took both of us pulling to get it open, and when it finally gave way, this stale, thick air rushed out. Not rotten or moldy, but old and wrong somehow, like opening a jar that had been sealed too long. The room was maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, no windows, just bare concrete walls and floor. But it wasn't empty, not really. There was a metal bed frame pushed against one wall, no mattress, just the springs all rusted and sagging in the middle. Next to it sat a pink plastic bucket, the kind kids use at the beach, and beside that, several water bottles, all different brands, some still half full with liquid that had turned yellowish. The walls, though, that's what made Ashley grab my arm hard enough to leave marks. Starting about 3 feet from the floor and going up almost to my eye level, there were scratches everywhere. Not random scratches, but deliberate ones, grouped in sets of 5, like someone had been counting days, maybe weeks. In the corner farthest from the door, there was a pile of fabric that turned out to be clothes. A faded yellow sundress with tiny daisies on it, a pair of jeans that looked like they'd fit a teenager, some t-shirts, all of them dusty and stiff. But underneath the clothes, that's where things got worse. There were notebooks, 3 of them, those black and white composition books kids use in school. The pages were wrinkled and torn, covered in handwriting that started neat and careful but gradually became frantic, harder to read. The same phrase appeared over and over on some pages. He says I'm getting better, but I'm not sick. Other pages had drawings, crude sketches of a window, always the same window with 4 panes and curtains, drawn hundreds of times like someone trying to remember what the outside looked like. Ashley was already backing toward the door, but I kept reading, finding grocery lists written in different handwriting, probably mail, with items like crackers for downstairs and more batteries for the lamp. At the bottom of one page, in that same neat writing that had turned desperate, someone had written, "Mom would be 47 today, with the date May 12th, but no year." I grabbed the notebooks and the clothes, stuffing everything into a garbage bag we'd brought down for cleaning. Ashley was already on her phone trying to call the realtor, but it was Saturday afternoon and nobody was answering. We stood there in our basement staring at that open door, and I noticed something else. Fresh screws holes in the doorframe on the inside, like there had been a handle there once, maybe even a lock, but from the inside. Someone had removed it before installing those bolts outside. We decided to search the rest of the house more carefully, and that's when we found more evidence. In the attic, pushed far under the insulation, there was a box of VHS tapes, each one labeled with just a date, spanning about 2 years. We don't own a VCR, but the labels were enough to make my skin prickle. The dates matched up with some of the notebook entries. There were also receipts, dozens of them, for things like protein bars, vitamins, cases of water, all purchased at different stores around the state, never the same place twice. We called the police that evening, after spending hours going through everything we'd found. 2 officers showed up, Officer Garrett and his partner, a younger woman who took notes while Garrett examined the room. They took the notebooks, the VHS tapes, everything. But Garrett pulled me aside before leaving and told me something that made my whole body go cold. About 8 years ago, a local man named Douglas Henley had reported his 16-year-old daughter Melissa missing. She'd supposedly run away after an argument about her grades. The case went cold after a few months. No signs of her, no activity on her social media, nothing. Douglas had lived in our house until 5 years ago, when he died of a heart attack at work. The house sat empty after that, tied up in legal issues because Melissa was still listed as his next of kin, technically missing but not declared dead. Garrett said they'd be testing the room for DNA, checking those notebooks for handwriting matches, but the look on his face told me he already knew what they'd find. That night, Ashley and I stayed in a hotel. We couldn't bring ourselves to sleep in that house, knowing what had happened below our bedroom, below our kitchen, below the space where we'd been planning our life together. The next morning, Garrett called to confirm what we'd suspected. The handwriting matched samples from Melissa Henley's school records. The DNA from hair found on the clothes was hers too. But here's the part that still keeps me awake sometimes. They found evidence that she'd been in that room as recently as 5 years ago, right up until Douglas died. She would have been 19 by then, locked in that basement for 3 years. The receipts showed he'd been feeding her, giving her vitamins, even buying her feminine products. In his twisted mind, he was taking care of her, protecting her from something, maybe from growing up, from leaving him, from becoming someone he couldn't control. The police searched every database, every record they could find, but Melissa Henley had vanished completely after her father's death. She'd simply walked out of that basement and disappeared. The investigation dragged on for weeks. Detectives came and went, taking measurements, photographs, digging through county records. They found out that Douglas had installed those bolts himself. There were charges on his credit card from a hardware store, dated just 2 weeks after Melissa's disappearance. He told everyone she ran away, played the grieving father perfectly, even put up missing person flyers around town for the first few months. Meanwhile, she was right beneath everyone's feet, scratching those marks into the concrete walls. The VHS tapes, when they finally got them converted to digital, showed nothing but static and occasional glimpses of that basement door, filmed from the stairs like he was checking to make sure it was still locked. Hours and hours of footage of just that door. Ashley found out from a neighbor, Mrs. Coleman, that Douglas used to have loud music playing in his house all the time, said it helped him concentrate while he worked from home. Now we understood what that music was really drowning out. We couldn't sell the house, not right away, not with it being an active crime scene, and later not with everyone knowing what it was. The horror house on Sycamore, kids started calling it. Ashley and I tried to stick it out, tried to reclaim the space, but every creak of the floorboards made us think about what Melissa must have heard above her all those years. Every time we went to the basement to do laundry, we'd see that doorway, even though we'd taken the door off completely. The room stood empty and open, but it felt occupied somehow, like the weight of what happened there had soaked into the walls. We lasted 3 months before moving back in with Ashley's parents. The house is still ours, technically. We're still paying the mortgage while it sits empty. The realtor, Mrs. Blackwood, finally admitted she'd heard rumors about the previous owner but didn't think they were worth mentioning since nothing had been proven. We tried to sue, but our lawyer said we didn't have much of a case since technically, no crime had been committed in the house after Douglas died, and he was never convicted of anything while alive. Then, about 2 months ago, I got a call from Officer Garrett. They'd found her, not Melissa herself, but traces of her. She'd been working cash-only jobs, staying in motels under fake names, always moving, always running from something. A social worker in Montana had recognized her from the age progression photos the police had circulated. When they finally made contact, she was living in a tiny apartment above a laundromat, going by the name Claire. Garrett said she was physically healthy but wouldn't speak to anyone about those 3 years. Would barely acknowledge they'd happened at all. The only thing she said about her father was that he'd convinced her the world had ended, that there'd been some kind of nuclear disaster, and he was keeping her safe in the only place that wasn't contaminated. He'd wear a fake radiation suit when he brought her food, told her everyone she knew was dead, that going outside would kill her in minutes. The day he died, his employer had called the house phone repeatedly when he didn't show up. She heard it ringing above her for hours before the sound finally stopped. It took her 2 more days to work up the courage to try the door, only to find it had been unlocked the whole time. The bolts were just for show by then, just part of maintaining the lie. The state pressed charges posthumously, more for the record than anything else. Ashley and I finally sold the house last month at a massive loss to a property developer who plans to tear it down. They're going to build 2 smaller houses on the lot, fresh starts with no basements. Melissa, Claire now, she sent us a letter through her social worker, just 1 line. I hope you can make good memories there. We couldn't bring ourselves to tell her we'd already left, that nobody could make good memories in a place like that. Sometimes I drive by the lot, especially now that they've started demolition. Yesterday I watched them fill in the basement with concrete, truck after truck of it, like they were burying something that should have never existed. Ashley says I need to stop going back, that we need to move forward, and she's right. But every time I see a basement door with a lock on it, even a normal one, even from the inside, I think about Melissa counting days in sets of 5 on those walls, waiting for a world to end that had already ended for her the moment her father decided she belonged to him forever. Moving into that old house felt like hitting the reset button. My daughter Emily was 7 at the time, full of energy and curiosity, and I was determined to make the place ours. It was a small 2-story home on a quiet street, the kind of property that needed more elbow grease than money to bring it back to life. I was juggling a full-time job and parenting alone, so every free hour went into sanding walls, pulling up old carpets, and painting while Emily sat nearby with her crayons. Life was messy but steady, and in those first few weeks the noise of hammers and the smell of fresh paint became our soundtrack. One Saturday afternoon, while pulling up the warped floorboards in the upstairs hallway, I noticed something wedged between the beams. At first I thought it was just trash left behind by the previous owners, maybe scraps of wallpaper or an old shopping list. But the papers were folded neatly, stacked together like they had been hidden there deliberately. The handwriting was cramped and slanted, written in blue ink that had faded slightly. The first page started with a simple line: "Lights out at 10:37, curtains drawn at 10:42. My initial reaction was confusion. It didn't take long to realize these weren't random notes. They were observations. The deeper I read, the more unsettling it became. The notes listed out times, actions, and even descriptions of the people who had lived there before us. Man leaves for work, 7:12. Wife smokes on back porch, 7:34. Child bikes around block, 315. It was all written in obsessive detail, down to the brand of cereal boxes left on the counter and the exact color of shirts worn. I could almost picture someone sitting in the shadows, jotting everything down. My chest tightened as I flipped through the stack, realizing it covered weeks, maybe months, of these people's daily lives. Whoever wrote this hadn't just been curious, they had been watching. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about those notes. Lying in bed, I kept replaying the words in my head, the way every movement had been cataloged like entries in a twisted logbook. Emily slept soundly in the next room, unaware, but I found myself getting up twice just to check her window locks. I told myself the stalker had probably been long gone, that the notes were just remnants of another family's nightmare, not mine. Still, there was something about the way they had been tucked away so carefully under the floorboards, as if meant to be found later, that made it hard to shake the unease. 2 days later, I was in the kitchen making dinner when I caught myself glancing at the window above the sink more than usual. The blinds were open just enough for someone to see inside if they wanted. That thought crawled into my mind and stayed there, so I pulled the cord and let the slats fall shut. Emily came bouncing in, asking if she could ride her bike before it got dark. I almost said no, but I didn't want her to notice my uneasiness. Instead, I told her to stay close, circling the driveway where I could keep an eye on her. Even then, I found myself stepping outside with a dish towel still in hand, scanning the street for movement. That night, as I was folding laundry in the living room, I heard a faint scrape, like the drag of a shoe on pavement, right outside the house. I paused, listening. The sound didn't repeat, but when I peeked through the blinds, I thought I saw the faint glow of a cigarette ember across the street. Just a pinprick of light, then gone. My heart thudded hard against my ribs. I stood there in the dark, barely breathing, wondering if someone had been standing there the whole time, quietly watching. I told myself it was probably just a neighbor, but I couldn't shake the possibility that it wasn't. The following morning, a new sheet of paper slid under the front door. It wasn't folded, just laid flat, with that same tight handwriting. This time, the details weren't about the family before us. They were about me. Coffee made at 6:41. Daughter eats cereal at 7:03. Leaves porch light on until 8:12. I remember the way my fingers trembled as I held the page, the letters blurring because my eyes watered with panic. Someone had been outside close enough to see everything we did down to the minute. I locked every door and window in the house, even though it was broad daylight, and called in sick to work. Emily didn't understand why I wouldn't let her play outside that day. She kept asking, and I kept dodging, trying to keep my voice calm. I didn't want to scare her, but every time she walked near a window, I caught myself pulling her back or closing the curtains tighter. I even went upstairs and checked under the beds, inside closets, places I knew were empty, just to convince myself. Still, every corner of the house felt thinner, less private, as if whoever was writing those notes could see through the walls. That evening, after putting Emily to bed, I sat in the living room with every light off, staring at the front door. I wanted to catch whoever was doing this, to prove to myself it wasn't all in my head. Around midnight, there was a faint creak on the porch boards, the kind you only hear when someone steps on them. I didn't move. My pulse hammered in my ears as I watched the silhouette of paper slide under the door again. I didn't pick it up right away. I just waited, listening to footsteps retreat down the walkway, measured and unhurried, like they had no fear of being caught. When I finally bent down, I saw the page was shorter this time, just one line. Window upstairs left open at 9:26. My breath caught in my throat because Emily's window was the one facing the street, and I knew I had left it cracked earlier to air out her room. I bolted up the stairs, nearly tripping, and slammed it shut. For the first time since moving in, I sat on the edge of her bed until she stirred, brushing my sleeve against her hair as if that would shield her from whoever was outside. The house felt less like shelter and more like a glass box. The next morning, I packed a bag for Emily and drove straight to my sister's house 2 towns over. I didn't even leave a note behind. From there, I called the police, who agreed to check the property. They found no one, no sign of forced entry, and no fingerprints on the papers. The officers told me to be cautious, but admitted they couldn't do much without catching someone in the act. When I asked if they had seen the notes, one of them looked uncomfortable and simply said, "We've seen cases like this before. Sometimes they stop as suddenly as they start." That wasn't the reassurance I was hoping for. I never went back to that house. I broke the lease, lost the deposit, and moved into a cramped apartment closer to family. It wasn't ideal, but at least I could breathe again without constantly checking windows and blinds. Emily adjusted quicker than I did. She doesn't remember much beyond me being extra worried back then. I still think about those notes sometimes, about the fact that someone had been close enough to track our lives minute by minute. The papers are still with the police, but no one ever called me with updates. To this day, I don't know who was watching us or why, but I'm certain of one thing. If I hadn't found those notes under the floorboards, I might never have realized we were being observed until it was too late. It didn't take long after moving into that neighborhood for me to notice something strange about the house directly across from ours. At first glance, it was practically a mirror image of the one my wife and I had just bought. Same shape, same siding, same front porch, but it carried this odd frozen quality, like it had been paused in time. The grass was cut but never freshly trimmed. The windows were intact but always dull with dust, and the mailbox leaned at an angle that looked permanent. Neighbors waved politely when we settled in, but no one ever mentioned that house, almost as if it wasn't worth bringing up. During the day, it looked harmless enough. Kids rode their bikes past it without even glancing at the porch, and delivery trucks never stopped there. My wife Claire joked that it was the ghost twin of our home, which made me laugh at the time. Still, I found myself glancing at its windows more than I'd like to admit. The blinds were always tilted in a way that blocked the view inside, and the front door had a heavy chain across it, something you don't often see on suburban homes, unless someone really doesn't want visitors. The first time I saw a light inside, I thought I had imagined it. It was close to midnight, and I had gone downstairs to grab a glass of water. Through our living room window, I noticed a faint glow. Not bright like a lamp, but more like the flicker of a television. I stood there for a good minute, trying to figure out if it was just the streetlight reflecting, but then it shifted, like someone had walked in front of it. I told myself maybe a realtor or maintenance worker had stopped by, though it didn't explain why anyone would be there that late. A week later, it happened again, only this time Claire saw it too. She had just come out of the shower and was pulling the curtain shut in our bedroom when she called me over. There, on the second floor of the empty house, a silhouette passed in front of the window. It wasn't a trick of the light. The shape had weight to it, like a person moving with purpose from one side to the other. We stood in silence, staring, waiting for it to happen again. When nothing else moved, she whispered, "But nobody lives there, right?" I didn't know how to answer. The next morning, I casually asked one of the neighbors, a man named Frank who was out watering his lawn. I pointed at the house across the street and asked if anyone still owned it. He didn't hesitate, just shook his head quickly and said, "Nobody's been in there for years." Then he changed the subject so fast it felt rehearsed. Claire and I brought it up to a couple others over the next few days, and the reactions were the same. Dismissive shrugs, quick topic changes, a weird determination not to talk about it. That silence only made the place more impossible to ignore. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. One afternoon, I walked across and circled the property. Up close, the similarities to our own home were eerie. The same shutters, the same paint color, even the same small cracks in the driveway concrete, like it had been copied and pasted. But there were subtle differences too. The porch railing had tiny scratches as though someone had dragged something heavy across it, and the back gate was padlocked with a thick rusted chain. Peering through a side window, all I could make out was darkness, though I thought I smelled something faint, like burnt plastic seeping out. That night, Claire shook me awake around 2 a.m. She whispered that she had heard a voice, faint and muffled, like someone arguing. We pressed our faces to the window and watched. The second floor glowed again, but brighter this time, as though multiple lights had flicked on at once. The shadows moved, long and stretched, crossing back and forth. We couldn't hear words clearly, just that low rumble of human sound, the rhythm of a conversation. Yet every part of me knew no one should have been there. I told her we'd ask the HOA directly in the morning. The following day, I called their office. The woman on the line checked her records and after a pause said, "That property doesn't belong to anyone anymore." I pressed for clarification, and she repeated herself, slower this time, as though trying to discourage me from asking more. "It has no owner," she said before excusing herself and hanging up. I sat there with the phone still in my hand, stunned. How could a house with working electricity, blinds that shifted, and clear signs of movement have no owner? Claire didn't want me to pursue it further, but I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. That evening I sat on the porch just to see if anything would happen. Hours went by in silence until around midnight when the house lit up again. This time the glow wasn't steady. It pulsed, like someone walking room to room, switching lights on and off. Then in the upstairs window I saw it. The blinds shifted slightly, and a pale hand pressed flat against the glass. No face appeared, no body, just that hand lingering there for several seconds before slipping out of sight. I nearly called the police but hesitated, unsure how to even explain it without sounding ridiculous. Claire begged me to stop paying attention, but the more we ignored it, the more aggressive the disturbances became. One night, all of our outdoor lights flickered off at once, even though the breakers were fine. Across the street, every window in that house blazed with light, brighter than I had ever seen before, then snapped into darkness in unison. The next morning, our mailbox was wide open, and inside was a scrap of lined paper with nothing but a circle drawn in thick black ink. Claire swore she hadn't touched it, and neither had I. The breaking point came a week later. We woke to loud pounding, steady and deliberate, echoing across the street. From our bedroom window, we could see the front door of the vacant house shaking, as if someone were slamming against it from the inside, though the heavy chain held it shut. Then the noise just stopped, mid-strike, and everything went still. No light, no movement, nothing. That silence was worse than the chaos. We sat there listening, waiting, but it never resumed. By dawn, the house looked as dead and empty as it had on the day we moved in. We decided to move out shortly after. Claire couldn't sleep anymore, and I couldn't focus on anything else. Before we left, I asked the HOA one last time if they had any explanation. The woman on the phone gave me the same answer, but this time she sounded tired. That house doesn't belong to anyone. We sold our home at a loss just to get away. Sometimes when I wake at night, I picture that hand pressed against the glass across the street, waiting, and I still wonder who or what was living in the house that no one is supposed to own.